Hi, and welcome back to the Contemporary Old West channel. In today's episode, you'll hear Chapter 4 of my novel, Hunting Charm, and I'll have another plate of history beans. If you like my writing, I hope you will visit my author's page on Amazon, link below. If you're interested in signed copies of Hunting Charm or any of my novels, please check out my Patreon page, also with a link below. If you enjoy the video, I'd be grateful if you hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. So without further ado, this is Chapter 4 of Hunting Charm on the Contemporary Old West channel with B.F. Biles. Chapter 4 recap. First, if you haven't listened to chapters 1 through 3, let me encourage you to do so. Those chapters are available on my YouTube channel. Like any book, it's best enjoyed from the beginning. However, if you want to forge ahead, here's a quick recap. Chapters 1 through 3, the reader is introduced to most of the main characters in the book. First, we meet a group of folks living in a township located in Indian Territory a few years after the Civil War. Cecil Johnson and his wife Cynthia, and a mysterious former slave everyone calls Cactus Branch. At the end of Chapter 1, we meet Doreen Tarwater, the spoiled daughter of Abilene, Kansas stockyard owner Theo Tarwater. By chance, Doreen stows away in a wagon driven by Cecil Johnson's nearly deaf and blind hired man, Mr. Sugars. In the next two chapters, our story moves ahead a few weeks, and we meet the two heroes of our story, Matt Grayson and Hunter Brantley. We learn that Theo Tarwater has hired Matt and Brant to find the man he now believes killed his daughter. That unfortunate man is none other than Cecil Johnson. In Chapter 4, A Spirit Foreboding Disaster, our story skips back in time to 3 days after Doreen's decision to leave Abilene, hidden aboard Cecil's second wagon. Chapter 4, A Spirit Foreboding Disaster. Doreen Tarwater managed to remain hidden beneath the tarp covering Mr. Sugar's wagon for nearly 4 days. At times, she felt mildly claustrophobic. Other times, she cried, contemplating her sufferings. She was comfortable enough thanks to a large bolt of calico fabric that served as a headrest and her small valise, which provided cushioning for her bottom. Thanks to the temperate spring weather, she was neither too warm nor cold. She sneezed once and had periodic hiccups, but the sound of the mules and wagon, along with the fact that Mr. Sugars suffered from hearing loss, prevented detection. She spent most of the first 2 days dozing and reading from a book of Shakespeare's sonnets. She managed to slip out both evenings to relieve herself and refill her water flask. On the second night, as the men slept in their tent, she found a bit of jerky and a few crackers left near the fire. The third day, she almost wet herself, but with the help of a challenging sonnet, managed to wait until they stopped. She vowed to drink less on the fourth day, but by noon realized she wasn't going to make it. Shakespeare's most insidiously arcane verse wasn't enough to take her mind off her bladder. There was also the matter of Mr. Sugar's singing. The man simply wouldn't stop. She recognized none of the songs he sang, and eventually she realized he was simply improvising. Mr. Sugars repeated phrases, words, and melodies endlessly, making subtle changes, refining his extemporaneous composition. On the first 2 days, she found his singing pleasant, a gentle accompaniment for her comfortable ride. On the fourth day, however, as she sat squirming beneath the tarp, she wanted to scream for him to stop. A lamb lost and lonely wandered far and astray. Couldn't see how the master cared for it every day. Little lamb without sense, traveling on that new way, wandered so far and wide, nevermore would she play. Poor fool, never seeing his care. Poor fool, precious father is there. When Cecil saw Doreen leap from the wagon from the corner of his eyes, he wondered if he had seen a ghost. Chief McQueen spoke of spirits that appeared suddenly, usually signaling great ill or disaster. Cecil had never seen a ghost, but when he saw Doreen, he felt the hair on his neck rise. "What in Lord's name was that?" Mr. Sugars exclaimed as both wagons came to a shuddering halt. "Not sure. I think it might have been a white woman." "Lord have mercy." A half-minute later, Doreen, feeling better, rose from behind a thicket of oak brush, straightened her dress, and turned back toward the wagons. Having decided the colored men must be employees of a farmer somewhere in Kansas, Doreen, pretty and vain, pulled herself up proudly as the two drivers stared at her in astonishment. "Hello, ma'am," Cecil gulped. "It's quite a surprise seeing you in these parts." "Hello, yes, I imagine that is so. I was forced to stow away on your wagon. My father has been brutalizing me at home. I appreciate the provision of refuge." Cecil knew that most whites felt that a colored man speaking to a white woman was an act of over-familiarity. So a long moment of silence passed before Doreen continued. "I suppose you're wondering who I am?" Yes, ma'am." "My name is Doreen, but you boys must address me as Miss Tarwater. As I indicated, I'm fleeing an abusive environment at home. I would like you to take me to whomever you work for and allow me to make my explanation there." Cecil looked at her, speechless. Another long moment passed. "What is your employer's name?" Doreen asked. Cecil gulped and said, "Well, I am, as they say, self-employed. This here is Mr. Sugars. We ain't kin by blood, but we're family all the same. So I suppose you might say I'm his employer." "No, I don't believe you understand what I'm saying. I need you, gentlemen, to take me back to the man you work for." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Cecil paused once more, removing his hat, running a nervous hand through his hair. "Thing is, we ain't got no employee other than our own selves. I have a ranch off in Indian Territory. That's where we're headed." The revelation that the men were not hired hands sank in slowly. A child of privilege, Doreen was spoiled and sheltered. Like other white folks at the time, she had the strongly held misconception that colored folks lacked the mental capacity to manage their own affairs. Doreen's father, one of the wealthiest men in Kansas, had always given his daughter everything she desired. When Doreen got older, however, as young people often will, she began to behave unpredictably and often spoke rudely to both her parents. The transition happened gradually, and for a time, Theo Tarwater chuckled at his daughter's biting and sometimes hateful comments. Eventually, though, Theo lost patience and, upon the advice of his local pastor, converted to the biblical mindset that advocates for the use of the rod. Switching, as Theo called his punishments, usually took the form of a few swats with a branch cut from the cherry tree. While the spankings were generally more humiliating than painful, on a couple of occasions when Doreen continued to argue, one can hardly overstate the intensity of her tirades, Theo likewise lost control of his temper and left Doreen bruised and bleeding. After the second such disciplinary action, Ruth, Doreen's mother, recognized that things at home had become untenable and suggested their daughter attend finishing school. At the age of 16, Doreen was cajoled onto a train bound for the Lynbrook Girls' Academy in Kansas City. Predictably, Doreen detested the school. In truth, Lynbrook was filled with tyrannical instructors who had free rein to dole out all sorts of abuse. The head administrator, Mistress Sarah, a hulking woman with a pair of male enforcers she called advocates, sometimes ordered young ladies to be tied to a chair with one arm unbound just enough so that it was possible to write. Once bound to what the harsh schoolmistress simply called the chair, the student would remain until any homework that her instructors deemed substandard was completed. Before Doreen's arrival at Lynbrook, if one asked Mistress Sarah how often she had used the chair during her 17-year tenure as head administrator, she would have said the number was no more than 20. Generally, the mere threat of the medieval device was enough to prevent its use. On the occasions it was used, pre-Doreen, the longest any of the young ladies at Lynbrook remained tied up was just over 2 hours, and that occurred only because the missing assignment the student had refused to complete required that length of time to finish. During her 1.5 semesters at Lynbrook Girls' Academy, a period of just over 6 months, Doreen was bound into the chair on 6 different occasions. The 6th and final time, Doreen remained tied up in the school basement for nearly 30 hours, refusing to complete an English assignment requiring the conjugation of 60 verbs into all 12 basic English tenses. Had Doreen done the assignment in class, she would have had the benefit of working with a group of her classmates to sort through the having-dones and will-be-goings. In class, however, Doreen had called the assignment idiotic and had grossly compounded the offense by calling her teacher a vapid whore, with an IQ equal to the number of teeth possessed by the famously toothless boxer of the time, Jimmy Elliott. The comment had drawn a brutal slap from the instructor, which Doreen returned in kind. While in the chair, Doreen staunchly refused to do the assignment or apologize for her actions in class. After passing the 30-hour mark, Mistress Sarah, afraid that there could be legal ramifications, released Doreen. 2 days after that, Doreen left Lynbrook for Abilene, expelled for insubordination, rudeness, and sexual deviancy. Regarding the third charge, Mistress Sarah was forced to replace one of her advocates following Doreen's departure. As has been stated, the chair's bindings allowed an offending student the freedom to write. Unfortunately, the advocate guarding Doreen into the wee hours of the morning eventually found the exceptionally attractive teen's overt flirtations impossible to resist. Just as the advocate was enjoying the explosive pinnacle of Doreen's skillful ministrations, the janitor, an elderly woman who had been working for the school for over 20 years, arrived at her usual early hour to get the stoves lit and blackboards wiped for the day. The sight of the hulking advocate with his drawers down gave the elderly woman such a shock she nearly fainted. So Doreen, now 17, returned home, where the battles with her father not only resumed but grew more puissant. Eventually, Theo abandoned the familiar cherry switch, first for his belt, then for a buggy whip. In fairness, Doreen, using her nails and teeth, managed to inflict a few wounds of her own. Gradually, the house resembled a war zone, a place where Theo and Doreen occupied their unmarked but clearly delineated zones. Theo often decamped entirely to the saloon, and Delilah Henry, a prostitute he favored because she provided light-hearted companionship and reasonable rates. Likewise, Ruth Tarwater, Doreen's mother, left the scene, though she remained home. Ruth, who had once been staunch in her Christian standards, began adding brandy to all her drinks, coffee, tea, sarsaparilla, a favorite, and even milk. Rather than acknowledge the dissolution of her family, Ruth sequestered herself in books and an ever-increasing dependence upon nips from a sinister bottle of laudanum she kept beneath the skirt of her reading chair. During those bleak, normal days, when the Tarwater family, once so stable and happy, deteriorated, there was talk of college in Boston. Theo, however, knew he couldn't impose any regulation on his daughter's behavior at such a distance, and feared she might meet with some dire circumstance in what was reputed to be a town occupied by crude Irishmen and Germans. Despite all the bitterness between himself and his daughter, part of Theo, at times, still recalled the sweet girl Doreen had once been. He imagined that with time her childhood disposition might return. So things remained in an unsettled state. Theo would go off to work, then to the whorehouse. Ruth would sit reading and drinking in her chair, and Doreen, at least once or twice each week, would slip out for a rendezvous with one or another of the young men that struck her fancy around town. This continued until shortly after Doreen's 18th birthday, when she found out she was pregnant. There was some confusion about the father of the child, but Doreen, who had taken a liking to a card-playing dandy named Roman Cardenas, claimed he was the father. Theo, who knew of Cardenas, had no desire to invite a Mexican into the family, and secretly paid Roman $200 to leave town. The gambler was more than happy to comply and disappeared. Doreen, sensing her father's interference, threw a historic fit that culminated with the shattering of a piece of overpriced kitsch of Ace, reputed to be from the Ming Dynasty, which Theo had purchased in San Francisco for $50. Only then, as her mother cried over the remains of the prized fake pottery, did Doreen acknowledge that she had no desire to give birth to a fatherless child, and agreed with Ruth's request that they visit a doctor in Kansas City. Early one morning in May, Doreen climbed aboard the family cabriolet with Ruth driving, and the pair traveled east. When they reached the physician's office, the man seemed competent enough and spoke eloquently of his years working as a Confederate doctor during the Great War. The doctor bragged he had studied surgery at a facility in Chicago and had done the procedure Doreen required hundreds of times. Unfortunately, despite the doctor's credentials, something went wrong, and Doreen grew ill following the abortion. For nearly 6 weeks, she lay in her bed in Abilene, shivering and bleeding, and at one point near death. During the ordeal, Doreen lost 20 pounds. Following that experience, Theo, honestly concerned, grew adamant in his resolve to confine her to the house, and for a time, perhaps because Doreen herself feared another pregnancy, the plan worked. The day Doreen stowed away in Cecil's wagon, her mother had mistakenly ordered Doreen to deliver a note to a local merchant. Despite the early hour, her mother had imbibed so much brandy she had either forgotten about or perhaps had decided to loosen the rules regarding Doreen's confinement. Whichever the case, Doreen took the opportunity to fly the coop. Back on the prairie, 4 days from Abilene, Cecil Johnson stood awkwardly at attention in the buckboard, observing Doreen uneasily. They were over halfway home. By employing an extra team of mules and rotating the animals, they had been traveling late into the evening. Because one never knew when spring thunderstorms would release gouts of road-swamping rain, Cecil had even considered a pull through the night. At home, he would have chores waiting. The appearance of Doreen put him in a difficult position. An extra 8 or 9 days would be required to return Doreen to Abilene, then return to their current spot halfway home. By that time, there would surely be rain. The trail drive to and from Abilene had already taken 3 weeks. Cynthia and the children needed him. He had to get home. "So you're the owner of these wagons?" Doreen asked. "Yes, ma'am," Cecil affirmed. "I don't believe you're being truthful." "Well, I can't think of any way to prove myself." "Did you sell mules to my daddy? You do understand my father is the biggest stock dealer in Kansas. He doesn't take well to lying hired hands, so you best be honest." The young woman's statement left Cecil feeling disoriented. Had she just claimed that her father was Theo Tarwater? If that were the case, he had no choice but to return to Abilene. Cecil didn't know Theo Tarwater personally, but he did understand that powerful men often employ ruthless means to achieve their goals. As a new business associate of Tarwater's, Cecil also understood that failing to return the man's daughter could result in a lack of trust, a loss of his contract, and because of his skin color, perhaps much worse. "You're the daughter of Mr. Tarwater?" Doreen understood quite well that her father wielded a good deal of power, not only in Abilene, but across the entire state. Indeed, Theo claimed to be the richest man in Kansas, though Doreen knew her father loved to exaggerate his wealth. Still, Theo would be furious when he found his daughter missing. If he hadn't already, he would soon organize a posse to track her down. "What if I am?" Doreen tilted her chin proudly. "You are, ain't you?" "Aren't you?" Doreen corrected. "Lord have mercy," Mr. Sugars murmured. Cecil spent a long moment considering his options. Mr. Sugars began to hum almost inaudibly, accompanied by the chirp of grasshoppers and the occasional distinctive trilling of a nearby covey of quail. "We need to get back to the ranch house," Cecil said, addressing Mr. Sugars. "Cynthia's going to think we're dead if we stay out much longer. As soon as we get home and get these wagons unloaded, we need to take this gal back to her folks. It wouldn't hurt to send a telegram over at the fort if the telegraph office will let you in, just so Mr. Tarwater knows where his daughter is at." "I'm not going back to Abilene," Doreen said. "Oh, yes, ma'am. I think you must go on back." "No, I'm not." "Now, miss, your parents will be worried sick about your whereabouts. I don't reckon you left any word you were leaving." "I left because they mistreated me. My father beats me and refuses to let me leave the house, and my mother reads all day and drinks herself into a stupor. I'm sick of that place." "Now, miss, I sympathize. I do. The thing is, I have a family, a wife, and young'uns. What do you think your daddy is going to do if he finds out you run off with a couple of colored men? He's likely to... We're just poor folks, and I'll tell him you kidnapped me if you take me back." Doreen hadn't considered the statement before she said it, but her words had such a profound effect upon the two men, she continued. "I'll tell everyone that you bound me and made me ride in the back of one of your wagons for days. And I'll tell them other things as well. I'll tell them that you behaved improperly." The last phrase visibly terrified both men. After the statement, the younger man and the elderly Mr. Sugars became like catatonic pillars, not unlike those described in the biblical story of Lot's wife. It took several deep breaths before Cecil found the will to speak. "That would be a low-down thing. I done spoke on how I have a wife and children at home. I ain't never done anything to you or yours. Mr. Sugars and I didn't even know you were in the back of the wagon until just now. Nevertheless, if you force me to return, I shall tell everyone concerned that you took advantage of me in unspeakable ways." Cecil, still partially frozen from shock and fear, looked first at Mr. Sugars and then at Doreen. He started to protest further, then caught himself, wheeled rigidly, mounted the buckboard of the lead wagon, and snapped the reins. The startled team jerked into shuddering motion. They were instantly moving away at a medium gallop. Mr. Sugars likewise snapped his reins. Perhaps the two men hoped to simply leave Doreen there and thereby be free themselves from the dreaded apparition that had suddenly appeared in their presence. Unfortunately, Doreen, youthful and athletic, ran after the second wagon and, with an undignified leap, tumbled over the rear gate. A few seconds later, she had resumed her spot beneath the canvas, nestled amongst the assortment of household goods Cecil had purchased for the return trip. Both wagons shuddered along at top speed, mules snorting and colliding against one another. Doreen wanted to tell them to slow down, but something about the situation warned her off. Finally, after a half mile or more, the wagons quaking and shuddering the entire time, Cecil drew his reins, slowing the team to its usual walking pace. If Cecil's brain had been turned off until then, it now came back on in earnest. The young woman, clearly unstable, seemed unaware that her false claims might lead to the death of his family. Cecil realized Doreen's threats might be a bluff, but he had seen enough bad behavior from white folks to know her comment could not be ignored. Cecil also realized that Doreen's father might already have men on their trail, men on horseback capable of traveling at twice their speed. He glanced nervously behind them, searching for riders, thinking once again of Jake McQueen's admonishment about the appearance of ghost-like spirits foreboding disaster. Thanks for listening to Chapter 4 of Hunting Charm. Now it's time for another plate of history beans. In Hunting Charm Chapter 4, Cecil Johnson is on his way home when he realizes Doreen Tarwater is stowed away in the back of his second wagon. We've already learned that Cecil married a former slave once owned by Creek or Muskogee Chief Jake McQueen. So for Cecil, home is a place in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, located in what was then Creek Territory. The term Five Civilized Tribes is a bit contentious. I hope anyone listening in will forgive me. It isn't my intention to denigrate or otherwise create a hierarchy of cultural significance amongst the myriad of amazing cultures out there. My personal feeling is that all cultures are valuable and important and fabulous, each in their own way. I'll also say that the Plate of History Beans format isn't meant to provide an in-depth look at things. That's especially true of today's episode. In today's Plate of History Beans, I'd like to take a quick look at the 5 tribes that occupied the eastern half of what is now Oklahoma during the 19th century. Let me say first that trying to cover the histories of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations in 5 minutes is not possible. Each of these nations have distinct histories and cultures. Again, please forgive me. Today's Plate of Beans is about the bare bones basics, and it's about a term that isn't widely used nowadays. I simply use it here because it fits with the history of my story, and sometimes, even when history is a bit condescending or dismissive of complexities, it's important to understand how it evolved. The term Five Civilized Tribes became popularized in the mid to late part of the 19th century. The term gained usage because, to some extent, each of these 5 tribes made an effort to integrate into white American culture. They sometimes adopted European farming techniques. They intermarried with white settlers. They adopted Christianity, and in some cases, they even held slaves. Cecil Johnson's ranch, located in central Oklahoma, in Creek Territory, is the home of Jake McQueen. Cynthia Johnson, who owns the farmland where Cecil creates his mule ranch, was given the land by Jake. Sharecropping was common in the South following the Civil War, and another way the 5 civilized tribes followed white culture was through sharecropping. In my story, Cynthia McQueen is actually given a plot of land by Jake McQueen, so that isn't technically sharecropping. Now is where it gets more complicated when asking why the term 5 civilized tribes became used to describe these separate groups of people. There are 2 significant reasons. The first is related to how these tribes were seen by the U.S. government. Following the Civil War, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Department of the Interior viewed and dealt with the 5 tribes as a single entity. While the tribes themselves maintained their separate identities, they were asked to form a council that included representatives from each tribe to deal with the U.S. government. I'm not going to wade into the deep waters of tribal politics, but there were conflicts. Though almost all of those were solved peacefully. It was an amazing accomplishment, and I feel it speaks highly of these groups of people. In a sense, these tribes were more civilized than their white counterparts at the time. While whites were fighting a bloody civil war, the five tribes found ways to live together and compromise. Dare I say, they behaved like adults when the whites were, well, you know. The second reason the five tribes were more trusted, if that's the right word here, relates to a comparison of the five tribes to other tribes, particularly the Plains tribes of the time. While the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations were building farms, raising crops, breeding cattle and horses, the Plains tribes, such as the Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, and Sioux, still oftentimes lived nomadically, often warring amongst themselves and as often making their living by raiding white settlements. But not only white settlements, they were raiding the farms and ranches of the five civilized tribes. Now, the Plains tribes were magnificent in many ways. They lived in the way they had known for forever. Again, I'm talking about why the five civilized tribes were given that name. As I already said, it was, in part, about comparisons. Not only did the, quote, less civilized Plains tribes raid white settlements, they did the same to farms and ranches owned by members of the five tribes. So again, the five tribes were regarded as more civilized. I would be remiss at this point if I didn't note that the term civilized is a bit of a misnomer. I'll repeat by using it here, it isn't my intention to denigrate any culture or elevate any group above another. As a history buff, I'm no historian. The more closely I look at all the marvelous native cultures, both here in the U.S. but also in Mexico and South and Central America, the more I realize how little I know. In Hunting Charm, I'm writing a story. It's not meant to be a historical document or even a realistic look at how these people lived. I'm always delighted when anyone who has greater knowledge of the lives of these amazing peoples takes the time to talk with me. I also hope to have future episodes where I'm able to talk with some folks who still keep these cultures, languages, and traditions alive. If you have any comments on anything in my novel, Hunting Charm, or related to these brief, woefully incomplete plates of history beans, I hope you'll leave a comment below. I'd love to talk with you. I'm also going to post a couple of links below if you'd like to learn more about the five civilized tribes. That's it for now. If you like today's chapter and plate of beans, don't forget to subscribe. I'll be back next week with Chapter 5 of Hunting Charm and another plate of history beans. For now, I'll say so long from the contemporary Old West channel with B.F. Biles.